Good evening and welcome to the Mythical Ireland Podcast with Anthony Murphy. It's been a while since I did the last podcast. This is number 5. Several months have passed since number 4. I apologise for the hiatus. Things have been rather busy. I might get a chance to talk about some of that in tonight's podcast. Don't forget to follow Mythical Ireland and keep up to speed with everything that's been happening. First of all, see the website mythicalireland.com, and particularly the blog section, which gets updated fairly regularly. And I'm also on Facebook. That's facebook.com/Mythical Ireland. I'd love to hear your feedback on this podcast. If you'd like to give me some feedback or ask any questions about the topics covered, or indeed propose topics for future podcasts, drop me an email at mythicalireland@gmail.com, or indeed you can drop a comment in onto the YouTube link. And I'd be happy to try and address your comment or question in a future podcast. For now, I am going to try to cover 6 or 7 topics in this one, in the space, hopefully, of about half an hour. This is recorded live. I don't intend to do editing except for where it's absolutely necessary. So I'm going to try and plug my way through everything as quickly and as easily as possible. I'm starting tonight with a recent visit I made to the south of the country, to County Cork. Now, some of you will be aware that Cork and Kerry, that particular southern region of the country, is home to a lot of stone circles. Well, I got an opportunity to visit Drombeg Stone Circle on a beautiful autumn day when the sun was shining and the temperature was in the high teens. That's Celsius, about 18-20 degrees, something like that. Fabulous day with a group of American visitors. I was very impressed, I have to say. Drombeg's a beautiful site. One of the things that impressed me the most is the fact that in addition to the stone circle, there is the Fulacht Fia, the cooking pit, the fire pit and the cooking pit right beside, well, very close by, and indeed in proximity to that, the stone huts where it is assumed these people lived. Now, the dating of stone circles, I think, is an area which is not necessarily controversial, but I think probably lacking in evidence, in that the stone circles, I think, are normally dated in relation to the burials that are found in their vicinity. In the case of Drombeg, a skeleton of a young the remains of a young male were found in an upturned urn during the excavations there by Fahy in the late 1950s, and those remains were dated to sometime between 1100 and 800 BC. Known locally also as a Druid's altar, Drombeg is most famous for its winter solstice alignment. Now, following my visit, I was contacted by a gentleman called David Craig, and he had seen my YouTube video. Don't forget, my YouTube channel is also Mythical Ireland. I think if you follow the address youtube.com/Mythical Ireland, that will take you straight there. And the playlist that I've assembled that should be of particular relevance is the one called Mythical Ireland. David contacted me and said that based on the walk around video and walkthrough that I had done, he would be able to create a Sketchfab 3D model, which he then did. So thank you for that, David. The link to that is on my Facebook page. That's fascinating. I suspect that before too long I will investigate the necessary software to create these models, because it's something I'd be very interested in doing. There are several Sketchfab models and modelers on the web in relation to the prehistoric monuments, and these are well worth having a look at. The Drombeg one is not perfect because, as David says, it's more ideally done with still photographs rather than capturing frames from a moving video. So there are a few bits and pieces that look a tiny bit odd, but otherwise it gives you a good sense of the place. And of course you can scroll through it, as it were, and move it around with your mouse and have a look at it. So that's absolutely fascinating. I do want to go back to Cork. I have lots and lots of sites to see. We'll discuss that later on. In the meantime, there's a gentleman called Terence Meaden who's been doing quite a lot of work at Drombeg and of course at other sites in recent years. And I'm aware that Terence has produced a theory about what happens in relation to the sun and the shadows there. Now, without giving too much away, I'm going to be hopefully interviewing Terence at Drombeg in the next month or two, and I hope to produce a video for YouTube from that interview, so keep an eye out for that. All I can say in the meantime is that I thoroughly enjoyed my time in Cork. Absolutely fabulous part of the world, closer to the equator by a couple of degrees of latitude than the Boyne Valley, and hence tends to be a little bit warmer, and I think they enjoy slightly better weather conditions. So I certainly, that was in evidence during my visit. The next topic, which I'll briefly mention, is related to that, because on my way back from County Cork, passing up the M8 motorway, I passed Cashel and decided to stop by and have a look at the Rock of Cashel briefly, not too much detail. I didn't actually go in. I think it's during the day you can take a tour, but I was mainly photographing it from a distance. I was very interested in the folklore attached to the rock, particularly the story about how it was said to have been formed, and this occurred when St. Patrick was chasing a devil, the devil, pardon me, and there's a mountain about 20 miles to the north of the Rock of Cashel called Devil's Bit. Now, I haven't been there, and it's another place that I want to visit, but there's what appears to be a chunk missing out of the top of the mountain, and the legend is that as he was being chased by Patrick, the devil bit a large chunk out of the top of the mountain to make his path easier through the mountain, and that he spat the chunk of mountain out into the distance, and it landed at Cashel. And this is where, the later, I was going to say ruins. I suppose they are ruins. This is where the ruins were placed, or not replaced, built. I think 11th or 12th century round tower, and all the other ecclesiastical buildings there. Anyway, I had a thought that, the thing about throwing rocks from a distance, I have a feeling that, and I have to do more research on this, and perhaps maybe there are listeners out there who are more aware of the local stories than I am, but I have a feeling that there's an earlier version of that tale relating to perhaps Finn McCool, because a lot of stones and rocks that were thrown around the countryside, especially with standing stones, have a story attached to them that Finn McCool threw them there. And some in the northeast region where I'm based say that Finn threw this standing stone from the hill of Tara, or Finn threw this particular stone from Slieve Gullion. So I'd be very interested in hearing if there is a local myth pertaining to Finn in connection with Cashel, because, as I say, I suspect that would be the case. The Rock of Cashel was, of course, said to have been the traditional seat of the kings of Munster, and this is for several centuries before the arrival of the Anglo-Normans. But I just wonder, does it have a previous, let's say, pre-Christian history? And like many places, it probably does. Anyway, if you have any information, I'd be glad to hear it. Again, the Mythical Ireland Gmail email would be the place to do that. Or if you want to send me a message on Facebook, whatever works for you. The next topic for discussion is my ever-expanding library of books. Now, I recently read a couple of things on social media in relation to, people who have amassed large collections of books, and I'm sure my wife is very sympathetic, because, there are times when she feels that the books have taken over the house, and perhaps she's right about that. I am a bookworm in that I like to have a very large reading library. I don't read fiction. I haven't read any work of fiction in the last 10 or 15 years. My reading extends to reading the research material that I need to do what I do with Mythical Ireland. So I don't really have time to read fiction, just the same as I don't really have time to watch television. People often ask me, did you see such and such a program the other night on the TV? And 99% of the time the answer is no, because I quite simply don't have time for it. Anyway, in addition to some of the popularized versions of some of the myths, I do tend to also look towards the source material, some older books, some of the Irish Text Society publications, which would be transcriptions and translations of the myths that are in the manuscripts. Now, one of the social media posts, that I read about books was that, it's a good sign when somebody surrounds themselves with a huge amount of books, more than they will ever get the time to read. And I suppose what it reminds me of is that my knowledge is always being added to, and I love that. I love when I buy a book and I sit down with it and I find a passage that's relevant. And so occasionally, quite often actually, my blog posts and my new videos have been inspired by a spark of inspiration from reading something in one of these books. So it's been a very important sort of central facet of my work, is that I have a library which is, I'm just looking at it here, which is constantly expanding. And honestly, I don't think I'll ever get to read them all. That's the truth of the matter. However, I don't intend to read most of these books from cover to cover. The idea is that they are, I suppose they serve as a reference library first and foremost. So when I was in the south of the country, I picked up, I was just wondering before I entered the bookshop in Kinsale, which is where we were staying, I was just wondering, was there a book that would tell me the myths and legends and folklore of some of the ancient sites of County Cork, and perhaps including Drombeg? And I just happened to see on the shelf the cover of a book that looked really familiar. It's Cork Folk Tales by Kate Corkery. Now, I'm just leafing through it here. I haven't read it yet, but I did have, of course, a browse in the shop, and I saw that there are great gods and goddesses along the coast. That's one of the chapters. Warriors, kings, lakes and hills, women, caves and deep sea caverns. And I was immediately interested. There's a chapter about the Cailleach Vera, among others. And I said, yep, that's definitely one that I have to have. And that was published in 2017. Now, I'm not sure if this is a series. I think it is, because I also own Waterford Folk Tales and Meath Folk Tales. And in fact, the Meath Folk Tales was one that provided me with a couple of real nuggets, including, if you've read my book Mythical Ireland, mention of the Rosnaree Fort where the sleeping army is supposed to be, which is similar to the tale in County Louth in Garrett's Fort near RD, about the enchanted sleeping army under the ring fort. So I'm very much looking forward to Cork Folk Tales. That's published by the History Press Ireland, and as I said, the author there is Kate Corkery. Anyway, on to the next one. I suppose I should put the next two together. I purchased Tales of the Elders of Ireland, and this is dubbed as a new translation of Acalam na Senorach. Now, I hope I have the pronunciation right. I think that's early or Middle Irish. This was actually originally published in 1999, but the story that is known as the Tales of the Elders of Ireland is an interaction between Saint Patrick and the ancient Fenians, Caillte, I think, is the gentleman that Patrick has a conversation with, and about the exploits of Finn and the Fianna and sorry, I said Fenians, didn't I? Of course I meant the Fianna. I'm looking forward to reading that. I think there are likely to be several nuggets in there. Actually, the Finn cycle in general is one that I'm not quite as familiar with as perhaps I should be. But in conjunction with that, I also purchased from the Irish Text Society Agalo na Senorach, and this is Nessa Nishagda's transcription of it in the Irish. I think that despite the fact that I'm not a Gaeilgeoir and don't really speak Irish, I have realised in recent years the value of seeing the Irish and seeing the Irish words, and so it's always nice to have, for instance, with the metrical den Shanachas, the Gwyn translation with the Irish on one page and the English translation on the facing page, because you can look at the word from which the translation has been derived, and I suppose you can then follow up by going to the folklore and the other sources to try and find out what the alternative meanings of these words might be. So I'm looking forward to that. The English translation is published by Oxford World's Classics, Oxford University Press. It's thin. It's kind of thin. It only runs to about 250 pages. So that should be quite readable, and I reckon that's going to be an interesting source. Now, another purchase. I don't know what your feelings are about, reading mythology. I am quite particular. If I am referring to a myth, I like to know what the source of it is. So, is the source, for instance, in one of the manuscripts? If so, are there more than one translation? Is there more than one translation? What is the source for this myth? Now, there's a little bit of controversy around some of, say, Lady Gregory's work in terms of how she presented the myths, where, say, for instance, Kinsella's rendering of the Táin Bó Cúailnge is considered to be, I suppose, one that the scholar could rely on. Lady Gregory, I suppose, allows for a little bit of poetic license. But I just have to retrieve this from the shelf. So, in addition to Thomas Kinsella's translation of the Táin, I also have Kieran Carson's translation of the Táin, and that's been valuable to me. But recently I purchased from the Dublin Institute for Advanced Studies Cecile O'Rahilly's translation of Recension 1 of Táin Bó Cúailnge, and that's a hardback book, and again I'm really looking forward to getting stuck into that one, because I just realised that I met in the summer I met an archaeologist from Dundalk called Paul Gosling, and I just want to give a shout out to Paul. Paul has spent quite a long number of years researching the place names of the Táin Bó Cúailnge and trying to identify them in the landscape, because some places in the Irish myths are quite easily identifiable. So, for instance, Inverculpa is the Boyne estuary, and we all know that. But there are a lot of place names in the Táin where the actual location of them has been, I suppose, lost to time, and the place name hasn't been carried on. So Paul is tracing those, and I think that's really, really interesting work. And again, in the O'Rahilly translation, there's an Irish version and an English version, so you can compare the English with the Irish. But I suppose the whole reason I was mentioning the reliability is I picked up in a second-hand bookshop, and I have retrieved some absolute treasures from secondhand bookshops. My followers on Facebook will know this over the last few years, because every time I pick one up, I always post about it. I picked up a beautiful cover, red and black, Deirdre and Other Great Stories from Celtic Mythology, and these are stories that are retold by Owen Neeson. This book was published by Mainstream Publishing Company in 1997. Now, the book, it says on the cover, contains dynamic versions of some of the greatest and most powerful stories from Gaelic mythology, filled out and expanded for the modern reader. So look, if you're interested in reading Irish mythology, and I suppose you want a slightly dramatised version, maybe this is the book. I haven't, well actually when I say I haven't read it, I read the chapter about Deirdre and the sons of Turin, because that's a story that I'm interested in for reasons that I discuss in my new book, Mythical Ireland. If you go to the chapter about Irish names for the Milky Way, you will know that there's an inspiration there from the story of Deirdre and Naoise, her lover, who's one of the sons of Ishnach. Anyway, I'm not going to give too much away. I'm trying to remember how much I paid for that. Generally in the second-hand bookshops, I only pay €2 or €3 for these books, which is an absolute steal. Now, while I was in one of the shops, I couldn't help but pass up for the princely price of €2, the complete works of Oscar Wilde. Now, I know you're going to say, what's that got to do with mythology? I just simply couldn't pass it up. It seems to be, I mean, it is what it says, the most comprehensive and authoritative single volume edition of Wilde's works available, containing his only novel, The Picture of Dorian Gray, as well as his plays, stories, poems, essays and letters, all in their most authoritative texts. I tell you what, I don't know how much that book would cost to buy new, but it runs to 1,200 pages. It's like a doorstep. Anyway, Oscar Wilde's father, some of you might have guessed already, or might have been saying this to yourselves and realised the connection. Oscar Wilde's father, William Wilde, was an antiquarian, and he, in the middle of the 19th century, wrote a book called The Beauties of the Boyne and Blackwater, and that is an exploration of the historic sites and the mythology of the Boyne Valley region, and is one of the earliest such accounts, and is very valuable. Not sure that I'm going to pick up anything of historic value in the Oscar Wilde compendium, but I couldn't pass it up. At the same time, for the price of €1, I bought a beautiful book in a hardback book with a dust jacket on it, and it's called Celtic Mythology, and it's published by Geddes and Grosset. Now, I'm hopelessly bad at translations from languages that I don't know, but Geddes and Grosset. Now, having brought it home, I recognised some of the chapter titles. The Gods Arrive, The Rise of the Sun God, The Gaelic Argonauts, The War with the Giants, The Conquest of the Gods by Mortals, The Gods in Exile, and I realised that in fact this was a hardback version of Charles Squire's 1912 book, which I think was called Celtic Mythology, Romance and Legends, something like that. That's a wonderful book with lots of interesting information, which I have been dipping in and out of since I was doing research for Island of the Setting Sun, and that wasn't yesterday. I think I got my paperback copy of Charles Squire back in the year 2000 or 2001, and it's been on my shelf ever since. And in fact, I think a while back I bought another copy and I gave it away in a competition on my Mythical Ireland Facebook page. So, 2 more to go before I wrap up on the books. Meeting the Other Crowd, The Fairy Stories of Hidden Ireland, is a relatively new book by Eddie Lenihan, and Eddie would be a very famous Irish storyteller. And I've read a couple of the stories, and they're very, very interesting. If you're interested in the fairy lore, I mean, the fairies are, I suppose, a late arrival in terms of mythology and folklore. often considered to be sort of diminished versions of the Tuatha Dé Danann, or the gods. They emerge from the ring forts at night and dance in the middle of the night, and they cause lights to be seen around the lish and the raths. And of course, they're quite often troublesome folk, and beguile and lead astray several people who are walking home, perhaps from having one or two drinkies in the local shebeen at night, and lead them astray. One story that was very interesting was about a couple who, their house was very run down, and they wanted, the wife wanted to build a new house. She wanted the husband to build a new house, and the husband said no, and so she nagged him about it, and then eventually she threatened to leave him. So they built a new house, but from the first night they couldn't get any sleep because there were lots of noise, commotions, poltergeist-like activity going on in the house at night time when they were trying to sleep. And a local beggar man who was passing by told the gentleman who had built the house that he had built it between two lone bushes, and that in fact he had disrupted a fairy path, and that the fairies were going to find their way home regardless of whether there was a house in the way or not. And so he built a little fairy door in the side of the house, and from that night on there was no more trouble. Anyway, I won't spoil that for you. That cost, I suppose I should tell you who it was published by. It's Gill Books it's published by, and that cost a royal sum of €15, and I think that's going to be a very interesting and entertaining read. Last but not least, not too long ago, in the old bookshop on the Hill of Tara that's run by Michael Slavin, that is a place that I visit every time I go to the Hill of Tara, which is quite regularly. When it's open, I always go in, and unfortunately I nearly always parted with money because, well, fortunately, I suppose, in many regards, it is such an absolute treasure trove. I picked up a literary history of Ireland by Douglas Hyde. Douglas Hyde went on to become Ireland's first president. A literary history of Ireland from the earliest times to the present day, and I found immediately, looking at some of the titles of the chapters, who were the Celts, earliest history from native sources, Druidism, the Elysium, and belief in rebirth. I just said this is something that I absolutely have to have, and of course already in the short time I've been reading it, it has provided a couple of real nuggets of information, so I'm really looking forward to that one. That one is a rarer production, and that cost me the princely sum of €25. Anyway, worth every cent, I reckon. That's it on books. I think I've waffled on long enough on that one. The next topic, by the way, if there's anything you want to ask me about books, I'd be quite happy to discuss what's on my shelf, or if you need any recommendations for a particular subject, again, don't be afraid to drop me an email or drop a comment in underneath. A lot of people have been asking me, is there any update on the newly discovered Newgrange henge? Now, the honest answer is not really, because the one question everybody wants to know is it going to be excavated? Well, the first thing is that it's on a private land. It's on a farm. It's owned by Newgrange Farm, and that's actually quite an extensive farm in the vicinity of Newgrange and the UNESCO World Heritage Site. There's a lot of archaeology on the lands there at Newgrange Farm. The simple answer is not in the short term, not that I know of, not that I'm aware of. There aren't going to be any excavations. There are. I keep trying to tot up now how many henges there are, or similarly sized enclosures, and I think the total is 8. But perhaps somebody who's more of an expert on these things, an archaeologist perhaps, might be able to correct me on that. None of those has been excavated. There are 132 prehistoric monuments in the bend of the Boyne. And surprisingly enough, apart from Newgrange and Nowth, and of course all the satellite mounds in the immediate vicinity of Nowth, and a few bits and pieces here and there, the vast majority are unexcavated. That's not to say that the archaeologists wouldn't be interested in further research. I know that, when fields are ploughed, for instance, that a lot of lithic scatter or a lot of lithic material can be thrown up, stone implements, etc., etc. It's possible that somebody would like to do geophysics on the new henge to see perhaps if there's something there that can be seen that wasn't seen in the aerial imagery. Ultimately, yes, excavation is the best way to determine the exact nature of something and perhaps the age of it and what finds might be down there. In the meantime, it's been quite tantalising, I suppose, and I can't get away from the fact that there's a mystical aspect to the whole thing, in that it seems to be almost Tuatha Dé Danann like, the way this structure, or the image of this structure, emerged in the wheat crop during the worst of the drought there in the middle of the summer. It was probably visible in late June. The satellite images seem to show that it appeared in the latter part of June. We didn't discover it until the 10th of July, and by the end of July the image had faded again because the crop was ripening out. One can't help thinking that, this is a bit of a message from the other folk, and that they're basically letting us know they're still around. And it's fascinating because never in a month of Sundays, never in a million years would I have thought that there's a substantial structure down there, of that size, 575 feet in diameter, about 175 metres, in a field that, in the LiDAR imagery presented, the only thing of interest in that vicinity was a sort of a linear feature that puzzled the archaeologists, but certainly would not have led them to suspect that there was anything of this nature down there. It's fascinating on so many fronts. The double ditch feature is apparently entirely unique in Ireland. That has me intrigued. It's not perfectly circular, as a lot of people have suggested. It's actually I've created a plan of it, an illustration of it from the photographs, and that clearly demonstrates that it's not actually perfectly circular. So I guess the method used in these cases is a central post with some rope attached, and you walk around and sort of create your circle based on that. Well, that wasn't done using this method as far as I can see. What was very interesting actually from creating the illustration was that the post holes, or that's what we assume these circles of dots to be on the outside of the double segmented features. The post holes are very difficult to see on the northern and northeastern side of it. Now, I think, having been in that field a few times, I think that's because of the slope of the field. I think that the northern part of it is just very slightly higher up than the southern part, and perhaps it is just that whatever residual water was there after the drought gathered more efficiently on the southern end of it than the northern end. Anyway, the long and short of it is that I don't have any immediate updates as to what is going to happen to that henge in terms of the archaeology. All I can say, as I said, is that it is part of a working farm. Now, the site next to it, west of it, is site LP2, which was identified during the Instar project, which the report of which you can download from the internet. If you just type Instar, that's INSTAR, and say if you just type Instar Boyne, you can download a very comprehensive report, which has been great source material for me in my researches of the valley over the last 7 or 8 years. LP2 was imaged in geophysics using gradiometry as part of Instar, and LP2, the single segmented ditch features of LP2 actually reveal themselves in more detail in our aerial image from the drought than they did in the gradiometry. So I'm just taking a sup of water. What's the significance of that? The significance of that is that you could spend a lot of money doing geophysics of the new henge, and it might not show up any more detail than what was in the aerial photography. However, I suspect, as I say, those features that are a little bit more difficult on the northern side might show up in geophysics. Anyway, that's a possibility. Lots of people saying, why doesn't the government buy the field, Well, I'd have to sort of say, well, first of all, because I've mentioned several times that it's a farm, why would the government buy that field and not dozens of fields where there are similar structures? And some people have been quite aggressive in their approach, and saying, the government should do this and the government is useless and, X, Y and Z. Yes, the government has a remit in terms of the protection of national monuments. This is Ireland. Every field, every parish, every field, every area has a scattering of monuments dating from various times. Now, I know ring forts, which date generally from medieval times, but some of them I think are Iron Age, are ubiquitous in the Irish landscape. I think there are between 40 and 50,000 known examples of ring forts. Yeah, you could make the argument that this is not a ring fort, this is a henge. This is a much, much different type of structure, a much earlier, much rarer and much more significant structure. Yes, I know that. Look, I don't intend to get into it too much. That's not my role here. I'm the discoverer along with Ken Williams. We found it. We have a passionate interest in the monuments of the lands and of the Boyne landscape. I in particular have a passionate interest in the mythology of same. It's up to the authorities in terms of what they want to do with the archaeology of the valley. I know that the various archaeological groupings attached to the universities have a huge interest in what goes on in the Boyne Valley, and I think this is something that's excited them greatly, as it has us and the general public, who've been made aware of aspects of archaeology as a result of the summer discoveries that perhaps they wouldn't have been aware of previously. And of course it's introduced this word into the common vocabulary, henge, because people have an idea what a standing stone is or a ring fort. They might know what a dolmen is or a cashel. Much less well known are the henges, and people say, is this like Stonehenge? And I said, well, it is, except for without the stones and without the bank. It doesn't appear to have had a bank around it. So I suppose a double ditched henge with two rings of post holes around it. What would you call that? Would you call that a timber henge, a palisaded enclosure? To be honest with you, just between you and I, and everyone else who listens, I've heard that the archaeological community actually can't make up their mind exactly how to classify it. I'm calling it a henge until someone points out otherwise, and some archaeologist tells me that that's incorrect. There's been intense interest in the media, and lately I've been on TV. I was on Channel 4 with Tony Robinson, ironically on a programme called Hidden Britain by Drone. They said that they had to break the rules and visit Ireland because the significance of the discoveries that have been made here. And I also appeared on RTE. I will be appearing on National Geographic, but I can't say too much about that at the moment, but I will let you know when more details emerge. In the meantime, if you have any questions that you think I can answer about the henge, the new henge of Newgrange, dubbed drone henge by some of the tabloid media, then I'd be glad to have your questions. Can't promise that I'll be able to answer them. One of my recent blog posts was about the Dagda's Mound, and I hope that was one that piqued your interest, and I'm just having a look at it here as I'm talking to you. So in the Dinchanicus, which is a collection of place name myths, I think from the Book of Leinster in the 12th century, attached significance in relation to each of the sacred sites, a mythical significance, or a reason that place had come into being, or a reason that it was called such and such a place name. So you'll know through my work that I've written quite a bit about the Dinchanicus in relation to the Boyne Valley, in relation to Newgrange, in relation to Knowth and Douth, in relation to the Hill of Tara, for instance, and the Hill of Slane. It's been a significant factor in my work. But sadly, sometime between medieval times and modern times, we lost a lot of the labels, a lot of the names of the sites in the Boyne Valley. So all of the great mounds and the smaller mounds and the standing stones and other features had names and myths attached to them, but a lot of those were lost. And so what happens is that in modern times, archaeologists create these very arbitrary labels in which they give the monuments letters. So you have Mound A and Mound B and Standing Stone C. And it's all very boring and uninspiring and arbitrary. Now, Dagda, who's the supreme, I suppose, chief deity of the Tuatha De Danann, the sun god, according to a lot of scholars, was said in certainly in one thread of mythology, he was said to have been the one who owned and built Sheed Brog, or Shion Vrú, which is the old name of Newgrange, and that he was later tricked out of ownership of the brew by his son Angus Og. Now, the thing is that because Dagda and Boyne had an illicit union, because Boyne was married to Elkmar, Dagda had sent Elkmar away on an errand and had secretly had an affair with Boyne, and during the time Elkmar was away, which was a day in Elkmar's mind but 9 months in reality, Boyne had conceived and bore this child, Angus Og. But in order to conceal the illicit union from Angus, they sent Angus off to be fostered at Brilea by Midger, and so when Elkmar returned, he wouldn't know that anything had gone on. Now, there are 2 threads in mythology about the original ownership of Newgrange. In one thread, as I said, Dagda is the original owner. In the other, which is retold in the Tuchmarc Etain, the wooing of Etain, Elkmar is the owner. It is in the second thread that Dagda sends Elkmar away, of course, so that he can lie with Elkmar's wife Boyne. And that thread the thread concerning Dagda's ownership of Newgrange is contained in a story in the Book of Leinster called, in Irish, De Gobail int Shida, the taking of the She. Now, what happened was that Dagda distributes the various She, or mounds, among the various figureheads of the Tuatha De Danann. However, because Angus is absent during the apportioning of the mounds, because he was hidden away in Brilea, Dagda had distributed the mounds, but of course there wasn't one for Angus. Now, Angus returns to Brunabónia and demands his own She. Dagda informs him that, well, they've all been distributed and none are left. Angus protests about this. Apparently he has been left out and forgotten by his father. At this point, the wily Angus suggests a compromise. He petitions his father to allow him to stay in the She of Brunabónia for a day and a night. This seems like a harmless enough request, and what loving father could refuse such a request from his son, especially seeing as how he's concealed his son in a secret hideaway for all this time. Dagda agrees to Angus's suggestion, yields the brew to him, and the next day he returns to take it back. Angus refuses to leave. Why? He has been granted, he claims, day and night, and this is a quote, and it is of days and nights that time and eternity are composed. Therefore, there was no limit on his tenure of the She. Now, Charles Squire, the aforementioned, because I have his book, says that this logic does not seem very convincing to the modern mind, but the Dagda is said to have been satisfied with it and abandons the best of his 2 palaces to his son, who took peaceable possession of it. So this is how the ancient name of Sheed Broga changes to Sheed Machindog, the She of the young son. Angus was called the Mach-Og, the young son, because, according to the text of Tuchmarc Etain, young is the son who was begotten at the break of day, and born betwixt it and the evening. Now, we know Dagda was dispossessed of Newgrange, but we don't necessarily know what was the other mound to which he retired, and the answer to that question lies in a slightly surprising source, and that source is James Ferguson's 1872 book, which is called Rude Stone Monuments in All Countries, Their Age and Uses. And Ferguson tells us, by far the best known as well as the most interesting of Irish cemeteries is that which extends for about 2 miles east and west on the northern bank of the Boyne, about 5 miles from Drogheda. Within this space there remain even now some 17 sepulchral barrows, 3 of which are preeminent, and of course these are Newgrange, Knowth and Douth. But the critical information then follows. In front of the latter, but lower down, nearer the river, is a smaller one, still popularly known as that of the Dagda, and others bear names with more or less certainty. But no systematic exploration of the group has yet been made, so that we are very much in the dark as to their succession, or who the kings or nobles may be that lie buried within their masses. This mound down near the river is the one ingloriously titled Mound B. Now that's a substantial satellite mound. It's much bigger than the other satellite mounds in the Boyne Valley. I think it's about, I have to be careful here, it's about 40 metres in diameter. Is that what I think? Now I don't want to misquote. We were on an archaeological walk through the monuments on Newgrange farm with Geraldine Stout, the archaeologist, during Heritage Week at the end of August, and I think she said it was approximately 40 metres in diameter. Now, if I'm wrong about that, that is my error and not Geraldine's. But I think from now on I'm going to call it Dagda's Mound, because why would I call it Mound B when I know that there's this myth attached to it, that the most significant of all the gods who left Newgrange went to this mound down along the river so that his son could come into ownership of Newgrange. Ferguson certainly had a bit of imagination when he thought about what might yet lie hidden beneath this mound. The mound called the Tomb of the Dagda, he said, and the 10 or 12 others which still exist in this cemetery are all, so far as known, untouched, but still remain to reward the industry of the first explorer, there being no tradition of their having been opened, and no trace of wounds in their sides. We are led to expect that they may be intact, and that the bones and armour of the great Dagda may still be found in his honoured grave. And of course, if you want to read more about that, you can visit the blog section of mythicalireland.com. Just before I finish tonight's podcast, we're running up to over 3/4 of an hour now at this stage, I want to talk a little bit about film and videos and tie that in with the very last subject of the evening. So I've done quite a lot of video and film work over the years. Now, a lot of this has been done in a very amateurish way, just popping a camera on a tripod, or sometimes recording a video on my phone and popping it onto YouTube. This has been tremendously popular. A great deal of people who've encountered my work and who later contact me for various other reasons indicate that they encountered my work on YouTube first and foremost. Now, the reason I'm bringing this up is because I would like to do a lot more of this type of work, but not just, of course, in my local Boyne Valley, which is my comfort zone, which is my home zone, because I live in Drogheda, which, as Ferguson says, is only 5 miles away from the bend of the Boyne. Just take a sip of water. I would like to venture out and see all of these wonderful sites around Ireland, and to investigate their archaeology and their alignments and their astronomy and cosmology, and particularly their mythology. Now, I have a full-time job and life is very busy. Mythical Ireland has occupied a great deal of my spare time, especially in the last couple of years. Yes, of course, I would like Mythical Ireland to be my vocation and my career and the reason that I get up in the morning and all the rest. However, that there are the practicalities of paying bills and feeding the children and paying the mortgage to maintain the roof over the head and all that stuff. Anyway, I definitely want to do more of that type of stuff. It seems to be the one medium that people really seem to get to grips with, more so than the blog posts and the books, etc., etc. So on that front, I come to my last topic, which is Patreon. Now, if you've never heard of Patreon is basically a website where people like me, who are sort of creators of content, artists, musicians, writers, playwrights, etc., etc., are, I suppose, given the opportunity to do their work by enlisting patrons who support their work financially, so thereby enabling them to do what it is that they do. Now, I haven't traditionally been very good at, I suppose, asking for this kind of assistance. I've tended to do what I do and to be driven by the passion for it and the love of it. However, there are practicalities involved behind all these things. I would very much like, as I say, to do a lot more of what I do, write more books, make more videos, particularly interested in the area of proper filmmaking, and I think there are some wonderful and extraordinarily beautiful and poignant films and documentaries to be made around all these subjects. And of course I would like to travel around Ireland to get the opportunity to do that at places where I haven't yet been, or places that I haven't been in a long time and that I haven't had much time to explore. Your role in that is perhaps to help support me in that. Now, the way Patreon works is that basically you pay me a little bit per month. You make a pledge. You can pledge as little as $1 a month or as much as you like per month, and for the amount that you pledge, you get little rewards, and those rewards are listed on my Patreon page, which you can find at patreon.com/Mythical Ireland. Now, I'm not putting the begging bowl out in front of you. I'm not interested in doing that. All I'm saying is that I'm very grateful for the support that I have received. In the past, I've been able to publish one or two of my books with the help of contributions. And I obviously intend to do that again in the future. I have a long-running campaign to raise money for the Cry of the Sebok, for the printing of that. I'm glad to report that I am close, within, I think, a couple of short months of bringing the Cry of the Sebok in print edition to you. But look, in order to do all this work, I think there are, as I say, practicalities involved. I would like to have your support. I've been doing this work since the beginning of 1999. Mythical Ireland was established in March of 2000. I'm at it, as it were, almost 20 years, and I have never asked for contributions. I have done it as a passion. I have done it basically as a hobby. But I do think, especially following the summer discoveries, that I've been busier now than ever before, and it calls for bringing it to a new level. And I would like you guys to help me out with that, if that were possible for you to do. And of course, my gratitude would be unending for that. So again, just to remind you where you can find that, it's patreon.com. That's Patreon, patreon.com/Mythical Ireland. And if you wish to pledge a certain amount, well, as I said, I hope to reward you. What I've been doing lately is that I've been releasing content, especially video content, exclusively to my Patreon supporters, and later releasing it to general public release. When I do talks, I did one at Lough Crew this year, and I did one at Ishnock, and they've both been released to my Patreon supporters. I will leave the Ishnock one for a couple of months, exclusive to Patreon supporters only, before I eventually release it to the public. Anyway, it'll be your opportunity to maybe get involved in the whole Mythical Ireland project, which, as I said, has been evolving and now is at the stage where I need to make an investment, and that investment will involve some equipment, because the video camera that I have is a tape camera. It's an old HD tape camera, and I really need to be working in the digital world, and I need to also invest in some sound equipment, which I don't have at the moment. And of course it costs money to visit these places in terms of diesel and everything else. So there are the practicalities. Anyway, I'm not going to harp on about it. I do not want you to get bored by that sort of stuff and for it to turn you off. At the end of the day, I will do what I do in any case. And people who follow me on social media won't be at a loss, because you'll still get lots of pictures and information and blog posts and links to relevant material and all that stuff. It's just that I will keep the juiciest of the material for my Patreon supporters first and foremost, before moving to the rest. Anyway, I'll wrap up to say thank you very much for listening. I'm sorry that it's been so long since the last podcast. At the time of the discovery of the new henge at Newgrange in July, I spent 3 very manic weeks in which I was working full-time and dealing with the media full-time. I did not have time to do anything else for 3 weeks, and for a good while afterwards I've been dealing with TV companies and other media who picked up on the story, and so I actually didn't even get a chance to be out with the camera taking pictures in the landscape, which is, as you will know, something I enjoy doing very much so. So drop me a line if there's anything you'd like to comment on, discuss, as I said, especially if you want to suggest topics or questions for the next podcast. I'd be glad to have them. Do send me an email at mythicalireland@gmail.com. Do visit the website mythicalireland.com, and especially do look me up on the more active of the social media sites where I am ensconced, and I try to update pretty much every day, and that is on Facebook, facebook.com/Mythical Ireland. I do have to say one thing. I have 47,484 followers on Facebook. Unfortunately, Facebook's algorithms are not very fair to guys like me who are doing these pages as a passion rather than as a full-time paid profession. And if you don't advertise your page, they don't serve your posts to even the people who follow you. If you're following my page and you haven't seen anything for a while, that is only because Facebook hasn't served it to you. It is not because I haven't been updating. If you go to the page and where you've selected under liked, make sure that you select see first, which means that you will see my posts on your feed, because if you don't do that, chances are quite regularly you will miss my posts. And I remember specifically when that algorithm changed, because my traffic on the site dropped significantly. And just before we go, I did ask earlier on Facebook if anybody had any questions, and I didn't think there were any, and I'm just seeing now that there are. There are several questions actually, so we're kind of running against the clock here, but I'm going to try and address some of these, and maybe we can leave the rest to the next one. Maureen O'Leary says, hello Maureen, here's something that occurred to me recently regarding the method of creating Neolithic rock art. I know researchers know of tools that could have been used, and they usually add remarks of amazement for the ancients' tenacity in creating such works with so primitive tools. But is there another possible method? Could the work be done through deliberate erosion? I'm thinking of HCl from stomachs of livestock. Do you know if this idea has been proposed seriously or not before? Well, Maureen, that is a question that I can't answer right now, and I will perhaps put that out there on the page to see if anybody has any information about that. They talk about pocking. I talk about perhaps the twisting action, for the individual pockmarks being done with perhaps small pieces of quartz. Don't know about erosion. Deliberate erosion, that's an interesting one. I have no expertise in that. Hold my hands up on that one. If anybody does have, please comment on Facebook or send us an email. Stephen Williamson says, as someone mentioned above, can you speak of what is involved of getting permission to enter private land to view ancient sites? Well, there isn't an automatic right of way, as some people understand there is. It's very straightforward, Stephen. You should do your best to ascertain who the landowner is, and you should ask the landowner for permission to enter their land and to access monuments. I'm aware that there is an act in legislation called the Occupiers Liability Act, but from my understanding of it, and I'm not a lawyer, so please forgive me if this is an incomplete understanding, that act does not allow a visitor to a national monument on private land any more protection than a trespasser. Ultimately, the best way to approach these things is to always try to obtain permission. It's going to vary from site to site. There are sites that I am aware of that I access where the landowners are conducive to people accessing their land and don't have any problem with it generally. There are other sites, however, where farmers have encountered difficulties with, for instance, people accessing land that has sheep on it with dogs, and dogs worry sheep. It's that simple. People leaving gates open and allowing cattle to stray into other paddocks or maybe out onto roadways. So, look, the sensible thing always is to ask for permission. There is no provision, as far as I'm aware, in Irish legislation that guarantees antiquarians and archaeologists and researchers like myself access to sites. So the simple and best way to approach it is to try and exhaust as much as possible the means of finding out who owns it and can you get permission from them. Emer Seaver said, I would love to hear about any updates on the recent crop mark discoveries. Will there be any privately or publicly funded digs? What type of research will be possible? Okay, well, I think I've answered that one earlier on, Emer, and I hope you accept that as an answer. If not, we can discuss it further online. Are private landowners an obstacle in terms of allowing access to sites, and or do they have any obligations to allow same? Thanks. I suppose the answer is they don't really have an obligation. The clever thing, I think, so for instance, there are examples of sites where a strip of land has been purchased from the landowner to allow a fenced off pathway to the monument, which means that the person walking to the monument is safe from any livestock and they're not going to get attacked by livestock. That doesn't happen very often anyway, in fairness. And also that the livestock are safe from the visitors. Are private landowners an obstacle? They can be, because in some cases they don't want people on their land. And what can you do? You don't have an automatic right, and it's their land. So yeah, I suppose in certain cases, and I've heard anecdote, I'm not going to name names or talk about locations, but I've heard instances where landowners have actually been quite aggressive with visitors to national monuments on their land. So they can be an obstacle. The best thing to do is to try and make friends with the landowner and try to convince them of your bona fides. Just remember that a lot of landowners are living in isolated rural areas, and that rural crime has been on the up and people are afraid. And so you can understand a little bit of their fear and try to make the best approach possible and try to be amenable with them. If they say at the end of the day that you can't, well, it's simple, you can't, and I'm sorry about that, but until there's a change in Irish legislation, that is the case. Michael Ray Fox asks if there are any illustrations of Ireland's Irish Stonehenge might have looked like when it was used ceremoniously. Now, I think you might be referring to the Newgrange of Newgrange, Michael, rather than Ireland Stonehenge, which is the one near Dundalk. If you're referring to Ireland Stonehenge near Dundalk, there are images that have been recreated, 3D images by a Turkish 3D artist, a friend of mine called Kerem Gogus. And those images are online. If you search for Ireland Stonehenge and Mythical Ireland, you'll find those on my blog, and also they've been published in my book Mythical Ireland. In relation to the new one, not yet that I'm aware of, and might it have been used as a calendar? Well, you know my opinion on these things. I do think so, but can I provide you with explicit evidence? Not necessarily. I did a blog post a while back. Actually, I'll paste the link as an answer to your question on Facebook, which was a preliminary investigation of the possible alignment of the new henge of Newgrange and a possible astronomical orientation. So you can have a read of that. If that doesn't answer your question, please come back to me with a further comment and I will do my best. And the last question for the night is from Brian Smith. I've just learned of an author and researcher, Michael Poindar, and his book Pie in the Sky. I'm going to read it once I finish travelling. Do you know of it? Are his theories pseudoscience? Has anyone continued his research? It sounds pretty far out. I'm sceptical, but I'm also pretty ignorant. How smart were these Stone Age people? Now, I'm aware of the book and I'm aware of the author. Michael Poindar is now deceased, unfortunately. I have the book on my shelf along with two others. I haven't read it. I've dipped in and out of it. I know that Michael Pointer talks about ley lines and energy lines and energy fields. It's an area that causes raised eyebrows at the very least and some controversy. If you talk to an archaeologist about ley lines and earth energies, they will toss their eyes up to heaven and probably shrug their shoulders and walk off on you. Me personally, I don't do the whole energy line thing. I talk about ley lines in terms of the original interpretation of them, which was straight track alignments of sites over long distances, but not necessarily involving these mysterious earth energies. And look, I don't know what earth energy is. Are we talking about underground water? Because you can dowse for underground water. If you're talking about energy that's not electromagnetic energy, well, what kind of energy is it? And this is, I suppose, one of the reasons that the topic is controversial, is because what is earth energy? Is that just a vague way of saying, we've detected something that, with our dowsing rods, or is there some other way of determining that? Anyway, I'm not going to get into it too much with you. I think that some people would probably classify pie in the sky as pseudoscience, and of course there are people who would swear by it. The best advice that I can give you is to have a read of it and make up your own mind, because these things are always subjective. And I'm sorry if that's not as comprehensive an answer as you would have liked, but I've just gone over the hour mark by 5 minutes, and I don't think people generally listen to these things for that long. So forgive me for that. Anyway, if you've got further comments or questions, as I said, I'd be glad to have them. mythicalireland@gmail.com, or on my Facebook page, or on my Twitter, which is also Mythical Ireland, or anywhere else you can care to find me. In the meantime, thanks everybody for listening. I've had, as I said, quite a very interesting and busy time, and it's been fabulous being the discoverer or the co-discoverer of one of the greatest archaeological finds of the past decade. It's really, really wonderful. Yes, it's nice. Let's, I suppose, make that discovery count in terms of carrying on the work of Mythical Ireland to the next level, as it were. Good night, everybody. I've spoken for far too long, and at this stage I'm sure you're all switched off if you're not already asleep. In the meantime, have a good night's sleep, and we'll catch you on the next podcast. I'm Anthony Murphy, and this is the Mythical Ireland Podcast.